I'm not generally one to discuss politics, but there is one issue I care quite a bit about, and that's the ability for the main two political parties to get away with whatever they want. For example, nominating awful presidential candidates. One promising tool to help combat this is ranked choice voting, or RCV. And this is something I very strongly advocate for, but it's not always well understood. So I'd like to explain how ranked choice voting works and why it's useful. First, I'd like to examine the issues with the current standard, and for the sake of explanation there will be some simplifications made. In this example, we have our four 2020 presidential candidates: Republican Donald Trump, Democrat Joe Biden, Green Party candidate Howie Hawks, and Libertarian Jo Jorgensen. Now, for the last two, they're unlikely to get very much of a vote. See, people are afraid to vote for a third-party candidate because they know third-party candidates don't win. And third-party candidates don't win because people don't vote for them because they're afraid. This is a feedback loop that results in these candidates, who are often far better than their first-party counterparts, having absolutely no chance. So what we're left with is a breakdown that looks something like this, and keep in mind that this is an example, so the results here will not match the real election results most likely. But in this example, Republicans will have gotten 50% of the vote, and this is despite the fact that most Americans don't want Donald Trump in office again. Democrats will have gotten 48% of the vote, again despite the fact that most Americans don't want Joe Biden in office. And this leaves 1% of the vote for the Green Party and 1% of the vote for the Libertarian Party. And what we see is that the Republicans win. Donald Trump is reelected, despite the fact that most Americans don't want him. And this might swing the other way, in which case Joe Biden would win, but the result is more or less the same. You end up with a president that most Americans don't want. And they're able to do this because the two parties are only really competing against each other. They just need their candidate to be marginally better than whatever candidate the other party throws out there. So in the end, both parties can throw out a terrible candidate and stay in power. Now, let's take a look at ranked choice voting and how it works. So, for the voter, you simply need to rank the order in which you would be happiest with each candidate. So here are some examples of how different types of voters might rank the four candidates. So here we have an example of a die-hard Biden supporter, a die-hard Trump supporter, and down here, more average, probably, people maybe leaning a little bit left or leaning a little bit right. And just as one example, a die-hard Biden supporter will obviously put Joe Biden first, but their second choice may be Howie Hawks, their third choice Jo Jorgensen, and their fourth choice Donald Trump. Now you can put any order you want, and you can actually leave off candidates if you really don't want, I'm pretty sure. The other thing to note is that you'll see this more in a grid with bubbles to fill in or something of that nature rather than listing them out here, but this is easier for presentation. With that in mind, let's look at the results of our ranked choice election. Our first round of votes will only take into account what voters put as their first choice. In this case, we get the following. 14% of voters chose Donald Trump as their first choice. 16% of voters chose Joe Biden as their first choice. 33% of voters chose Howie Hawks as their first choice, and 37% of voters chose Jo Jorgensen as their first choice. So we look here and we see that Donald Trump is actually out of the race. But here's where the magic happens. Anyone who voted for Trump, their votes aren't gone. Instead, we'll take a look at everyone whose first choice was Donald Trump, and we'll see what their second choice was, and we'll add those votes to their respective candidates. So for this example, we'll say that 15% of voters whose first choice is Donald Trump chose Joe Biden as their second choice. 5% chose Howie Hawks as their second choice. And 80% chose Jo Jorgensen as their second choice. So to add these to these numbers, first we have to multiply by the percentage of voters who actually chose Donald Trump. So that's 14% in this case. And whatever this ends up equaling, we'll add it to these votes, to these three. And the results of that bring us into round 2, where now Joe Biden has 18% of the vote, Howie Hawks has 34% of the vote, and Jo Jorgensen has 48% of the vote. Notice that supporters for Donald Trump still got to have a say, even after their first choice candidate lost. This shows how the concept of throwing away your vote is no longer an issue. This means that people don't need to be afraid to vote third party, as shown in this example. But in round 2, we can see that Joe Biden has the fewest votes, and he's out. We'll now consider the next choice for all current Joe Biden voters. This means the second choice for those who initially chose Joe Biden, and third choice for those who had initially chosen Trump, but whose second choice was Joe Biden. So of these Joe Biden supporters, we'll say that 80% of them had Howie Hawks as their next choice, and that 20% of them had Jo Jorgensen as their next choice. Like before, we'll multiply by this number, 18%. And whatever that number ends up equaling, we will add to the remaining candidates' percentage. And so this will bring us into round 3. And here we'll see that Howie Hawks now has 48% of the vote, and Jo Jorgensen now has 52% of the vote. And here we see that Jo Jorgensen now has over 50% of the vote, and that means that she is our next president. Now, this could have happened before round 3, so in a previous round, if any of the candidates had achieved over 50% of the vote, the election would be over and they would win. Because obviously everyone else combined isn't going to end up with over 50% of the vote anyway. As you can see, no one's vote got wasted, and we managed to elect a candidate that most people will be okay with. On top of that, we quickly eliminated those candidates whom most people strongly dislike. Now, for the main two parties to hold on to power under the system, they'd have to run candidates who are actually decent in order to maintain power. But unfortunately, this is why it'd be a bit hard to implement on a national level. With the two parties currently in charge, neither of them are going to want to give up that power, so neither of them are going to be very supportive of ranked choice voting on that level. However, on a local level, this is more doable. In Maine, the first and currently only state to implement ranked choice voting, this actually ends up benefiting the Democratic Party and hurting the Republican Party. Maine is a primarily Democratic state, and this means that for many offices there are often multiple Democratic candidates, but perhaps only one Republican candidate. The Republicans who are there would often unite under the one Republican candidate, while the Democrats would split their votes across the various Democratic candidates, and this resulted in the Republican candidate having the highest number of votes, and they'd end up in office representing a mostly Democratic state. So with ranked choice voting, as the least popular Democratic candidates would lose the race, their votes would go to the next more popular Democratic candidates until ultimately you had Democratic candidates with a majority of votes. And this was a much better representation for the Democratic state. Because the Democratic Party benefited from ranked choice voting, they were very supportive of it. However, because the Republican Party was losing out on this, they were very opposed to it. However, because there's a Democratic majority, they were able to get this through. And depending on the state, you might have the opposite, where Republicans will be very supportive because they'll win out, and Democrats might be very against it because they'll lose out. But it's an example of how this can be pushed through on a local level, even though it would be really difficult on a national level. There are also some other voting schemes that could be viable, though ranked choice voting is probably the most tried and tested at this point. There's a saying that where Maine goes, the nation follows, and certainly when it comes to voting reform, I hope that's the case.